Hello, everyone, dear friends, dear colleagues. We are finally doing the much awaited webinar, unfortunately, due to the unfortunate events that took place in Turkey and Syria. We had to delay the event thanks to Nina. She was really understanding about it. She helped us a lot throughout the process. And we are very sorry for what happened, but it's been almost 1 month and we are trying to, find meaning into what happened. We are trying to understand. And we think as an ontological security cohort, also thanks to the support of Professor Bahar Rumelili and Helin Sarayertem, who have always been with us throughout the journey, and many friends we had the opportunity to work with. We are trying to understand what's going on, also from an academic perspective, but also from the emotions, the ontological security of the self, the state, how we formulate our relations with the state and each other. So it's, I think, we think also timely to hold this webinar, maybe to reflect also on the field and maybe to come up with new thoughts and go back to our academic mindset as much as we can during this troubling time. So without further ado, I will briefly introduce Nina. We are very delighted to have her and listen to her also as a colleague and also as a mentor. She also helps us a lot throughout our journey in the ontological security world. Nina is currently in Austria as an associate research fellow as well. And she works extensively, obviously, on ontological security theory, sovereignty, East Asia. She has many experience in Japan, also because she had some studies there also. And also a postdoctoral fellow at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, abbreviated as OIIP, where she currently pursues her research, also on emotional security and the state. So without further ado, we once again thank Nina and lead over to her. After that, we will continue with a Q&A and a discussion section. Thank you very much, Nina, and the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for this nice introduction. Yes, thank you. Thank you to you, Arman and Samar, for organizing this, for putting this together, for inviting me. Thank you to everyone who's here, even though, the date had changed because of the terrible events that happened in Turkey. The original date was exactly the day after the great earthquake. And I think, yeah, there wasn't really a question of having, a seminar like this, while the situation was still developing. So I think, I think the tragedy in Turkey will stay, not only with the people in Turkey, but with all of us for a long time. And, I think I just want to say I'm all the more grateful for everyone who's still sort of like, in that situation, chose to attend and to be here. So yeah, so just thank you. When I was invited, I was given the option to either present one paper or to I was given the option to either present one paper or a conceptual overview of my work. And since I do not currently have, unfortunately, a new paper working on ontological security, I chose to present a more conceptual overview of my thoughts, basically, regarding ontological security. So what I thought I would do today is sort of start by situating myself in the literature, and how I feel, where I think that I fit in. And then go over the three sort of main, I guess, theoretical arguments I've made in my work. And then sort of conclude with some final reflections. So that's the plan. Okay. So first of all, I think anyone who comes to the ontological security studies field, or just OSS, as I will keep calling it from now on. I think anyone can notice that it's, there's like a huge variety within the literature, right? Like there's people, scholars, from all different kinds of ontological standpoints actually are drawn and use the concept of ontological security, right? Whether they're like rationalists or constructivists or post-structuralists or whatever, which is good, I think, because it makes people talk to each other, maybe that don't usually talk to each other. So I think, and it also shows how intuitive the concept is, right? But on the other hand, it also makes it very confusing. If you are a newcomer to the literature, you're kind of trying to find your way, right? And then all of this is compounded, so to speak, by there also being like different understandings of the notion of ontological security itself and different ways, you know, where people apply it. And I think here, I think it's quite, you know, if you think about the OSS scholarship as a whole, you can sort of identify three broad strands. These are not exclusive. I mean, obviously there's work that doesn't really fit into either three of those circles, right? But I think broadly speaking, there's scholarship that really builds on R.D. Laing, and is what I would call like the existential psychological strand. Then I think probably the largest chunk of literature builds directly on Giddens, which is a bit more sociologically informed. And then there is obviously also a lot of people who've taken the concept of ontological security, merged it with the insights from Lacan, and given it a more like psychoanalytical spin, right? So I think that just knowing that there are these three sort of almost distinct strands can be quite helpful. And as you can see with the circles, I feel like there's probably some overlap between Laing and Giddens and between Giddens and Lacan. But I would say there's probably almost no overlap between, no merging of like Laing's and Lacan's insights, right? So yeah, and if I had to say, you know, where do I fit into this, right? So I think I'm about here. So I would say I'm firmly in the existentialist corner of the literature, but still somewhat close to Giddens in a sense that I sometimes, you know, I do draw on him because I do think like sometimes he has something interesting to say. But in terms of where I come from, you know, as my own personal outlook on life and how I think about things, it's more the quote unquote original and this Langian understanding of the term, right? So what does that mean? I mean, so existentialism can mean like different things in different contexts, but I think for the present purpose, I think what it means is that I focus on subjective phenomenological experience, right? So this is, for example, as opposed to unconscious motivations, like you might find them in Lacanian scholarship, right? So I'm not really concerned with unconscious anxiety or unconscious things, but it's about, you know, how someone actively feels. And so there's obviously the emotion scholarship involved here. And I think since there needs to be someone who does the experiencing of the world, who feels, right? I think it's my reading of it is also quite explicitly agent-centric, right? So there is someone, and I'm interested in this actor and their experience of the world, right? So that, for my purpose, that is what that means. In a second way, like, I've also had people refer to me as like a second wave or second generation ontological security scholar. I'm not quite sure how accurate this label always is, but I think in the present context, I think it can also be useful again. In a sense that what it means is that I can build, you know, on the insights of the original, of the first generation ontological security scholarship, right? So if you think about, you know, conventional OSS insights, you know, that would be something like, you know, ontological security is almost the opposite of physical security. We can define it as security of the self or security of identity. Threats to the self, you know, generate feelings of anxiety. This anxiety needs to be addressed in some way, right? And because, you know, it needs to be addressed, the anxiety is so unbearable, it can therefore also trump physical security concerns, right? So these are like some of the, I guess, the canonical tenets of like the first wave or like standard ontological security theory. And what it means, I guess, for me to be a second generation scholar is that I can just take these for granted and I can engage with these assumptions and rethink them, right? So I'm not really arguing with IR mainstream and trying to say why ontological security is a valid concept, because they have already done that, thankfully, right? Scholars before me have already established that ontological security is a valuable concept. So I no longer need to make that argument. So rather than, arguing against the realism, I guess I see myself more as arguing against other ontological security scholars, right? So that's, I think, a way in which this label, second generation or second wave, can be useful. Lastly, I think it's probably quite helpful to know that my way of coming at this is quite conceptual and theory driven, which means that I sort of start from the assumption that concepts really influence how we see the world and what we can see. So to illustrate this, I really like to use this image. I'm sure some of you will have seen it before, but it's like the duck rabbit illusion, right? So you can either see a duck or a rabbit in the picture. But how that relates to concepts is, I think that, let's say you had never seen a rabbit before. You would only be able to see the duck. And even if I tell you, no, there's a rabbit in the picture, you would not be able to see it, right? Because you do not have a concept of what a rabbit looks like. So in this sense, I feel in order to see anything in the world, I think in some way we can only see things that we already have concepts for. And so concepts are in that sense like tremendously important. And they're obviously also, the building blocks of theory. So if we, change or rethink concepts, then automatically we also change the theory, right? So that being said, while I obviously have some opinions about, what is real in the world and what is like an accurate description. Well, I don't think like the task of theory, of course, is not necessarily to provide an accurate description of the world, but sort of like it should be useful, right? Does theory help us to see something in a new light? Does it give us new insights? Is it useful rather than, I think this concern with usefulness is always, for me at least, more prominent than whether it's like accurate, right? And then lastly, I think a lot of what I do is quite state focused. So, I just happen to be interested in states. And I tend to treat states as persons with sort of psychological depth and the ability to feel and to have like experiences. But this should not mean that the arguments I make are not also applicable to other kinds of actors, right? I think they are. I just tend to talk about states, but I think many of the arguments I make can be extended to all kinds of actors, even though I do not explicitly talk about them. And also in this talk today, I will not really focus on the whole, are states people, do states have emotion kind of debate. It is something that is like obviously adjacent to OSS and is something that is important to think about, but I don't think it's at the core of any of what I do in terms of like OSS, right? All right. So with that out of the way, so what I am going to talk about today is basically what I did for my PhD dissertation. This is what it looked like. Titled Rethinking Ontological Security Theory, Conceptual Investigations into Self-Anxiety. It's a thesis I defended in November 2021. And it's a compilation thesis, which means it consists of an introductory chapter and 5 peer-reviewed articles. And talking about 5 articles in one talk is, of course, a lot. So I had, some choices had to be made. And for the rest of this presentation, I will mostly focus on the 3 main theoretical arguments as they relate specifically to OSS. So in a way, like the 5 articles, they make 3 distinct arguments. And they all also proceed in a kind of similar way, as in like I start from an observation or an assumption. I then sort of think through, what are the consequences of those assumptions, and then I try to like offer an alternative way of conceptualizing something, or like a way of rethinking these assumptions, right? So the underlying, the structural logic of each of the arguments is actually quite similar. And so hopefully that will make it easier for you to follow. Right, so I think the first observation one can make, and it was also the first observation that I made when I came, freshly to the literature, is that in a way, this whole research program of OSS is built on a quite explicit distinction between ontological and physical security, right? So you can see that in, like, for example, when Jennifer Meetson, defines it, it's like ontological security is security not of the body, but of the self, right? Or security of the self as opposed to the physical body. I think Baharama Lily also, she talks about how the pursuits of ontological and physical security are like have their own logics and dynamics. So there's a distinction here, right? Like ontological security is what physical security is not, which is of course, it's quite useful distinction, I guess, because it really helps you to carve out your place in the discipline, right? You can sort of position yourself against the mainstream, against realism, and it really like makes it easy for you, I guess, to show the added value of this concept. So in that sense, obviously, it is very useful. But at the same time, I think it is also, it contains this assumption, obviously, that the self is actually independent of the body, which is a kind of Cartesian dualism that is obviously very prevalent within the discipline overall, right? And I think with that come all the problems that other scholars have pointed out with regards to Cartesian dualism. But I think that my main issue with this, and when I sort of like thought about this, was that I don't think it's true. And when I say I don't think it's true, what I mean is like, I don't think it corresponds to our experience. So I think if you think about, how we all experience the world, I think our bodies are shaped in quite profound ways, how others see us, how we in turn see ourselves, the identities we develop, like how we feel we belong to groups or not, like I think even like to some extent what legal rights we have, right? Like I think our bodies are like profoundly important. And I think, how we see ourselves or fit into society would change profoundly if like from one day to the other, for example, I don't know, if I had an accident and I was like no longer an able-bodied person, like that would probably be like the biggest ontological security crisis I can think of for myself, right? So I do not think, I guess, that it's true that what happens to our bodies is somehow independent from our sense of self, right? And what actually makes it even more surprising that that ontological security studies of all fields would sort of like reiterate and reaffirm this Cartesian dualism, is of course that like Lang and Giddens did not have this dualistic understanding. So when they talk about ontological security, it is very much, embodied. They talk about the embodied self. Like that's not even my terminology, that's Lang's terminology. He has a whole chapter on the embodied self in his book, right? So just to give some examples, so so Giddens says that ontological security is linked to the self being safe in the body. The body is not just a physical entity we possess, it is an essential part of sustaining a coherent sense of self-identity. Lang obviously also says in his definition that the ontologically secure self is spatially coextensive with the body. So for both of them, that was actually quite key and quite important. And that also makes it I mean, for me at least, made it quite, I was quite surprised when I read that, because obviously I read Lang and Giddens after I had read some of the IR scholarship, and to sort of find that there was this what I felt was quite a profound difference, right? And so my proposal, I think, building on Lang specifically, and to some extent, is I think, you know, maybe it would be good to reconceptualize the self as embodied. And then that this obviously raises the question, you know, what does that even mean, right? And I think to me, it means that there is a genuine two-way relationship between physical and ontological security in both a positive and negative sense, right? So, I mean, we all know that from the works of Jennifer Mixon and Brent Steele, that, you know, actors or states in their case that feel ontologically insecure, that they might put themselves in position that also makes them more physically insecure, right? So they might not be able to remove themselves from conflict. Or Brent Steele, I think, has this great example of how Belgium during World War II, you know, for ontological security reasons, basically chose to fight Nazi Germany rather than, you know, give up and sort of like preserve their physical security in that sense, right? So we already know this relationship in one way, but I think the other way is also true, in a sense that I think if you are in a position you are physically insecure, I think that also has sort of psychological consequences, right? So if you think that someone threatens to make you less whole, like to dismember you, you know, that obviously has, like, you know, psychological consequences. And I think that we maybe can also understand a lot of, you know, let's say military buildup, for example, as not just, you know, a response to some physical insecurity, but also, you know, as a kind of ontological security response, right? I think in that sense, I think we can properly think of it as a two-way relationship. And in terms of, and I think it also means that sort of physical, as I just mentioned, physical security measures can, you know, function to reassert one's sense of self and provide a certain amount of ontology. So the example I use in my work has to do with Japan. But if you think about states more generally, obviously states, I mean, all bodies are constructed, including our own. But I think this is maybe especially so for states, right? And let's say states construct their physical bodies, you know, via, at the very least, territory and citizens. So usually we think of, like, you know, threat to citizens or territory as a sort of physical security threat. And then in my work, I used the example of Japan and North Korea to sort of show how a certain kind of physical threats that North Korea poses to Japan are actually in Japan understood mostly as an ontological security threat, you know, as like undermining of like this Japan's capacity to be a proper state, you know, making them feel like, okay, like you're not, you know, respecting that we are our own independent state. And that is actually a more important issue than like the nuclear threat, for example, that North Korea might pose to Japan. So, and in that sense, I think it does provide some additional explanatory value, although the issue of how to construct the body and what exactly constitutes a threat to the body is like a more, complicated one. Right. So a second observation I think we can make with regards to the OSS literature is that actually the concept of the self is quite often sort of operationalized as, you know, in a similar way to the notion of identity. So this is sometimes it's quite explicit, as when some scholars, you know, explicitly define ontological security as a security of identity or stability of identity, psychological self-identity need, like these sorts of definitions, right? Sometimes it's a bit more implicit, where, like, you know, even though scholars might talk about how ontological security is about the self and the security of being. If you then look at the empirical application of it, they still tend to sort of talk about identity. And so in both cases, though, I think the underlying assumption that we can identify there is so that, many people sort of conflate self and identity or implicitly think that it's sort of the same thing. And I think this is not something that is unique to OSS. I think this is probably more generally an assumption that stems from other constructivist research. So that's not necessarily something that is unique to OSS. But I think it is sort of something that is especially important for OSS because the notions of self and identity are so important to the very framework of what ontological security is, right? And the consequence, obviously, of sort of thinking or viewing self and identity as almost the same thing is that then ontological security and the whole ontological security framework itself becomes reduced to a matter of identity. So in a way, I mean, first of all, I think this is obviously, we can ask the question, are self and identity really the same thing? But it also raises the question of the added value of an ontological security research program. Because there is obviously a much older literature on identity in constructivist research, right? So then what is this concept really adding, or is it really adding all it can if we actually then think that ontological security is in the end only about identity? But maybe more important even than those two objections, I think, is again this idea of analytical utility. Because I think conflating self and identity actually limits what we can do with the theory and how we can use it. And it does so in at least three ways, I think. So for one thing, if you think of if we reduce ontological security to being mostly about, the preservation and about identity, then we kind of overlook other aspects of the ontological security framework. And here again, so if we go back to the quote unquote original writings of Lang and Giddens, they talk about how, ontological security is about experiencing oneself and the world as real, clearly differentiated identity, autonomy, being continuous in time, being spatially coextensive with the body. I think Giddens, he puts it a bit more succinctly, when he talks about, there's multiple existential dimensions to OS, and then they relate to time, space, continuity, and identity. So I think the point here is that for both Lang and Giddens, identity is an important part of ontological security, but it is not all there is, right? There's at least three other dimensions that they identify, and we kind of tend to not really focus on them. And maybe there's maybe this is a missed opportunity here to do a bit more and to see whether there's a bit further applicability of this whole framework, right? I think a second way in which the conflation also sort of doesn't really help us is, if ontological security is about the security of the self and self is identity, we tend to become overly concerned with the preservation of existing identity, right? Which then means that somehow all change to identities to be seen as bad in a sense of as a source of ontological insecurity or anxiety, right? And then this in turn leads to an overly empirical focus, I think, on identity contestation. So this is a case where sort of within the conceptualization of the theory itself, it sort of steers also our empirical interest in certain ways. Whereas I think, obviously, not all change is bad, right? And especially something like identity is inherently contested, like some identities might be more dominant than others, but there's no such thing, I think, of it as an uncontested identity. And so if you then, since you can therefore, almost by definition, find contestation everywhere, does that mean that you can also see like ontological insecurity everywhere, like, and I think that's kind of like the problem we end up with, where well, it's about existing identities, but identities are always contested, and therefore everyone is always ontologically insecure. And that is sort of like, I feel like it's a result of a specific conceptual thinking, or thinking about these two key concepts. And lastly, I think if you conflate self and identity, sort of think of them as the same thing, it also means that we're not really in a position to actually investigate the relationship between the two. And that, again, might just be like another missed opportunity that prevents us from seeing certain things in the world. So in response, my proposal or my suggestion would be to sort of keep self and identity as distinct concepts, and to think sort of like as self as a kind of subjectivity, as the kind of personhood. So self is someone who has in turn multiple and potentially changing identities, right? And I think this is something we do recognize at the individual level. I mean, it's like as we go through life, we have different identities, in different contexts, at home, at the university, and all of our identities, they also change, as we go through life and grow older and all that. But at the same time, there's something that remains the same, right? There's something that still makes us recognizably us. We're still like the same person, even though we've undergone through many changes. And I think that's kind of how I think about the difference between self and identity. That self is this more fundamental aspect, that remains the same, but identity are sort of like the moving, changing parts around it. And if you think about this in the context of states, I think, in the just similar like to the conflation of self and identity, I think it's also not uncommon in the literature to view statehood as just another kind of identity, right? But at the same time, states can undergo like profound changes and transformation while still sort of remaining the same political entity. So if you think about England, for example, which used to be one of the foremost slavery countries in the world, but then also became one of the first like big advocates against slavery, for example. Like these are like profound changes that we can still sort of like attribute to the same continuous entity, right? And the example I use in my work comes from Taiwan, where, I think if we understand self and statehood more as a kind of subjectivity, then we can also see how sovereignty in a way matters differently and in a quite distinct way from identity. So for example, like, Taiwan's identity has changed from, being like an authoritarian state that like identified itself very much as like a Chinese state. So now, a democratic state that sees, its role in the world quite differently. So that's like a change in identity that we can observe, while still also observing that it is a political entity that is quite profoundly anxious about its selfhood and being a state in the first place, right? And if you think of like being a state as just a kind of identity, then I think we cannot really account also for other kinds of identity-related changes. So I think there's a certain kind of analytical utility here in keeping those two concepts distinct, because I think probably Taiwan, in my assessment, is quite secure in its identity as a democratic, technologically developed and so on kind of state, but it is still quite worried about being a state in the first place. And I think those are two very different concerns. And I think there's a difference in whether I'm questioning, to give another example, there's a difference in whether I question whether Sweden is really a humanitarian superpower, like it likes to portray itself, or whether I question whether it is a state in the first place, right? So in one sense, I'm questioning whether it is a state. In another sense, I'm questioning what kind of state it is. And there's a difference in that. And I think, questioning someone's self is arguably more anxiety inducing than just questioning what kind of self someone is, if that makes sense. So that's how I at least think this distinction can play out. And this is also why I think, that, as I said, not all states are secure in their statehood. There's a lot of de facto states, I guess, in the world who can attest to that. And if we sort of if we do not think of everything as just being about identity, I think then we can also, I guess, pinpoint or distinguish different kinds of ontological security threats that otherwise maybe we are a bit blind to, right? So that's how I think it can be quite helpful. Lastly, I think a third observation one can make with regards to the conventional ontological security scholarship is that the notion of anxiety is actually quite ambiguous. Like it means different things to different people. But I think we can identify at least two ways in which there is some ambiguity. So for one thing, I think there is the relationship between the terms anxiety and ontological insecurity is actually quite unclear, as in like both of them sort of function as opposites of the term ontological security, right? So if I want to say that someone is not ontologically secure, I can say they're ontologically insecure, or I can say they're anxious. But what then actually is the difference? What is the relationship between those two terms then, right? And in a second way, I think we can also see that some scholars think of anxiety as a temporarily limited condition, as in like, something happens that gives me anxiety, but then I do something about it. I try to combat the anxiety, and then I reinstate, my default state of ontological security. So in this sense, anxiety is like a temporary disruption that can be overcome, and like the normality of ontological security can be reestablished, right? But then there's also other scholars who sort of feel that, anxiety actually, it's a constant, it's part of the human condition. We're always anxious in some way or form, even if we're not, maybe consciously aware of it, there's always anxiety. And therefore, actually, this anxiety cannot be overcome, which is why ontological security is actually not something that can be achieved. So these are obviously very like opposing ways of thinking about what OST and the literature and anxiety. But I think the implicit assumption in like all of them is like, whether you fall like left or right of this distinction, for all of them, I think there's a sort of implicit equation again of like anxiety and ontological insecurity. Like the two terms are sort of like understood as being almost the same thing. And this is something where I again feel like, okay, maybe this isn't like super useful to think about it in this way. So first of all, I think again we can I guess my main objection to this is that I don't think it's true. And again, I mean, when I say it's not true, what I mean is like it doesn't correspond to our experience. I mean, maybe this is a question that everyone has to answer for themselves, but personally, at least, I do not feel anxious all the time. And so since that is not my experience, I'm kind of like already skeptical of this kind of assumption, right? But maybe more importantly, with regards to the framework's, analytical utility, if we do think as anxiety and ontological insecurity as sort of the same thing, I feel like it means that actually we it becomes more difficult to distinguish between different kinds of psychological conditions, right? So if you remember that, when Lang first coined the term ontological security, he was interested in explaining schizophrenia, which is, obviously a quite extreme condition that not everyone suffers from. There are some people, some of his patients, they were just very anxious, but not necessarily schizophrenic. And other people were like so anxious and they developed schizophrenia, but not all, right? So how then, but I guess he also made this distinction because like not everyone, is the same. But then if we say that everyone is anxious all the time, how do we actually account for differences in actors and people, right? So I think this is like the distinction basically becomes lost if we conflate the two. And secondly, this is maybe more of like an abstract point, but if we do not make a distinction between anxiety and ontological insecurity, then it also becomes a bit more difficult to know like when actors change their behavior and are actually able to adapt, or when they are, stuck in certain routines that they actually cannot get out of, right? So this problem has to do with the explanatory utility of OSS. But as we know from the literature, sometimes actors are being able to adapt and to sort of like, in response to anxiety, change their behavior or change something to reduce anxiety. And in other times, they're sort of like depicted as, precisely not being able to change, as being, stuck in routines and like not being able to overcome them because the routines are what gives them a certain, minimum amount of like ontological security. But then we don't really have any mechanism or like any theoretical way of accounting for when actors, states in my case, but all actors, when they might be able to adapt and when they are stuck with routines. And I think this is again sort of a result of this implicit conflation of the two terms. So the way I propose to solve it is to sort of reintroduce a much older distinction between anxiety, normal anxiety, and existential anxiety. And this is a distinction that Lang used it, but it actually precedes him, like it's older than Lang's writing. And to sort of think about, as normal anxiety being the kind of anxiety, we all experience from time to time. Maybe we did something that makes us feel guilty or whatever. And it's kind of like, it's something that is temporarily limited, but that we can do something about. Like if I'm anxious because I did something and I feel guilty about it, I can go and apologize. I can like take certain actions to try to make up for it, right? So I can try, to sort of engage in a kind of creative action to reduce my anxiety and be sort of a bit more, stable again. Whereas I think existential anxiety is a bit more, it's more rare, and it's quite extreme, as in it goes more to the core of the self and who we are, right? So in that sense, it's maybe not necessarily temporarily limited, and it makes sort of creative action more difficult because I'm more focused on just like holding it together and just like being a self in the first place, right? So this is then maybe where someone might be stuck in routines. So I think like if we have a distinction like that, at least we can sort of like attribute change, behavioral change to one camp and the inability to change to another camp. And this latter, this existential anxiety, is I think what I would call properly ontological insecurity, right? But obviously then this also means that what I think most of the literature actually does is talking about how actors in other states deal with normal kind of anxiety rather than ontological insecurity, right? And obviously like accounting for normal the everyday anxiety, everyday contestation is important, and it's a huge part, I think, of what the OSS framework has to offer. So it's not meant, to be dismissive at all, but it's kind of like, I feel it is a bit different from saying, oh, everyone is ontologically insecure all the time. So to summarize those 3 points, basically, so the assumptions I identified in the sort of first generation literature is that the self is often thought of as disembodied, that the self is conflated often, treated as the same as identity, and that anxiety is sort of equated with ontological insecurity, right? And in response, I have sort of, made the suggestion to rethink these assumptions and to think of the self as embodied, to not equate self identity, and to also not equate anxiety with ontological insecurity. So while these are obviously 3 distinct arguments, I think they're also in a way connected, or at least I think the assumptions are, as in, like, I think, maybe it is because the self is seen as disembodied that it becomes more easily conflated with identity, right? So maybe if we thought of if we had a more of an embodied understanding of the self, maybe we wouldn't so often slip into the language of identity, right? And similarly, maybe it's because much of the scholarship, tends to sort of view self and identity as the same thing, that this also makes a conflation of anxiety and ontological insecurity easier, at least, or it facilitates the slippage, perhaps, right? So in this sense, I think these are 3 distinct assumptions and arguments, but it's possible that they also sort of enable each other, and that these assumptions do not only have their own effects, but also knock-on effects related to other kinds of founding assumptions. Okay. So having said this much, let me end on like 2 different kinds of final reflection. One, having now talked about my own work and basically trying to give a summary of my own theoretical thinking, I'm obviously aware that there are some things that are not yet ironed out. And so let me just, point out some of the issues that I still see. And the first one is obviously, it relates to how do we even conceptualize the state, right? So in my own work, I did, I basically went a very standard route of like saying, okay, the state body is probably territory and citizen, but we don't actually know what the state body is, how it is constructed, and what is part of it, right? Like for example, I don't know, China, for example, claims all of the pandas in the world for itself. So every panda in a foreign zoo is a loan from China, right? So does that make pandas part of the Chinese state body? Like what other things, whether that's like airlines or embassies or national products or whatever, what other things could be part of the state body? And, if they were threatened, for example, would also be understood as a threat to the state body. And I don't actually think we really know. And then that's maybe more of like an empirical question, but it's not something that is actually like a resolved issue, right? So presumably it is more than just territory and city, but we don't actually know what else different states construct. But I think there's also maybe an issue with how to increase the empirical payoff of like conceptual distinction, right? So while I find the distinction between self and identity very useful for me to make sense of, like, for example, the Taiwan situation, it is also the case that in practice, state articulate their identities often using the language of sovereignty, and sovereignty can itself become part of a certain identity narrative. So the two aren't, in practice, if we look at rhetoric and discourse, they aren't always that distinct, and that can make it actually difficult to apply in practice, right? Similarly, the distinction between anxiety and ontological insecurity, for me, it's like a purely theoretical distinction. It is not empirically tested, and partially because it raises, this issue of how do we distinguish the two independently from the behavior to be explained, right? So if I say, ontological insecurity is related to an inability to change, but then this inability to change is also the behavior I want to explain, you kind of have like circular, reasoning going on there that makes it hard to actually make like in positivistic terms, at least, a sound argument. So I think while conceptually this distinction is very helpful, it's not quite clear actually how to make use of it in practice, to be fair. And lastly, I think an issue I sort of circumvented in my research, but it's kind of like, is it important to account for different degrees of anxiety, right? So even if we think of the category of normal anxiety, I think we can also imagine that we in our lives or different people even experience normal anxiety to different degrees, right? And does that matter? Like, does it make a difference? Like, is that something we should account for? And that is perhaps more, again, of an empirical question that I completely sidestep in my work, but it is something that, maybe the framework gets too complicated if in addition to different kinds of anxiety, we also try to degrees of each anxiety, right? But it is something that, I've been asked before, so I wanted to raise it, but I do not have an answer to this question. Okay, lastly. So stepping away maybe like a little bit from just my own work and what I see, other avenues for doing more OSS research. I think one theoretical issue maybe that could be paid more attention to is actually, whether anxiety is a cause or an outcome within the framework. So I think sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, right? Sometimes anxiety causes something to happen, sometimes something happens and the outcome is anxiety. And again, this is something where, I think different scholars, utilize the concept in different ways, which is obviously, fine. But it's an interesting question, whether that, whether there's something to be done here to, again, increase maybe like clarity or analytical utility. Beyond that, I think, because so much of the literature focuses on conflict, specifically intergroup conflict, like over identities and these sorts of issues. And we tend to sort of diagnose basically every actor automatically as ontologically insecure. I'm not even sure if we're in a good state to recognize a condition of ontological security. Like, what does it look like if an actor is ontologically secure? Like, who is, right? Because it's always so easy to point out potential issues where someone is being challenged, potential anxieties from contestation and conflict. But then do we even know? Would we recognize ontological security if we saw it, right? So I think that's maybe a question to think about further. I think the notion of the embodied self also holds huge potential to better integrate issues of gender and race into OSS, which so far hasn't really been integrated to the best of my knowledge. And I think, here I want to be clear that obviously scholars writing on gender and race have talked about the importance of the body for decades before I even had the idea of writing about the embodied self. So this is not at all anything that I have contributed or like come up with, but I do think maybe it offers an avenue to also bring more of that scholarship in and to think about how actually, issues of race and gender, also like able-bodiedness, how does that relate to ontological security in international politics, right? So I think there's potential here to do more in that direction. And then lastly, Yeah, I mean, I think it's it always surprises me how much of the literature is about intergroup conflict, and I think again there's potential to do a bit more. And for example, you know, to use OSS as a lens to look into the effects, the psychological effects of climate change. You know, what does it do to our understandings of ourselves and who we are in time, in space? You know, maybe there's also potential here to bring in some of the other elements of ontological security that I pointed out, you know, beyond identity, you know, time, space, like what does climate change do to us, who we think we are, how we relate to others, you know, in psychology, like in empirical psychological research, you know, climate anxiety is a distinct phenomenon. Is that something we can, you know, use as a lens to sort of like understand certain states or other actors, right? So I think there's also potential here maybe to go beyond just this focus on intergroup conflict and to think about, okay, what other kinds of anxieties are there? What other kinds of factors actually affect our sense of self and how we think about ourselves and how that might be threatened by various, you know, phenomena in the world, right? So I think these are some of the ways in which OSS, I think, could maybe go a bit beyond what it's been doing so far. Yeah, and I think that is all that I had to say. So thank you so much for your interest and for your time. You can always contact me if you have questions. I'm also happy to share the PowerPoint if that's helpful. But yeah, so that's it for me so far. So I'm looking forward to your questions if you have any.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight listening to another outlook on ontological security theory. It enabled me personally to have another take on what we have been discussing so far for the last 2 decades, maybe or so. So thank you once again. And as you had indicated, we may open the floor to general questions or discussion points. I know our cohort has, but I may kindly ask them to wait for a couple minutes, maybe, to give way to other colleagues and friends. Andrew Goodhart asks, thank you. Not asks, kind of a notification. I have to drop off for a meeting, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to dial in and learn from your work. Thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us. So I'm also opening the floor to our cohort, Samer, Nasu, Shebna, because I know we have plenty of questions. Nasu, would you like to go ahead first so that maybe we can, in the meantime, collect more questions for Nina?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And thank you for such a, I mean, instructive presentation, to be honest. And it was so clear. I mean, everything was so, I believe it sounded maybe simple, but it's the way you explain. And if you are able to do this, I mean, explain it in such a way, it means that, I mean, you have such a great insight into what you're talking about. And I was really amazed by the presentation. I loved it, every minute of it. And mostly I'm really easily losing my focus whenever I'm working. So this was a really great opportunity for anyone, I'm sure. And I'm just gonna keep it a bit short. And the question is actually, I really believe that, I mean, I do consider myself an existentialist as well, especially in ontological security studies. And I think it's important to it's important to differentiate between existentialism and the Lacanian stance, because in the basics, it's the first thing that I mean, telling us what to focus on and how to further make our research, especially how to pick your case or how to choose your standing viewpoint when you are trying to make sense of whatever you are trying to explain. That's why, I mean, if it's possible to just give us some information on it, that will be lovely. Thanks.
Should I answer one by one, Erman, or do you want to collect?
As you prefer. We have a couple more. I saw Enes's hand, another one in the chat, but as you wish. Maybe we can go one by one as you.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, if you're not pressed for time. Yeah, no, I do think, honestly, like, I mean, I think like part of your question is also about the difference between existentialism and Lacanian approaches, right? But there's also like a utility to having these different approaches. Because personally, at least, you know, every time I read Lacanian-inspired research, you know, it is so helpful for me to clarify my own stance. Because, you know, you read it, right? And then maybe you feel like, I don't agree. And then it's like, but why do I not agree? You know, what is the part, this Lacanian application that I do not agree with? And it really forces me to develop a better understanding of Lacan and of my own thinking. So in that sense, I feel like I would recommend it to anyone, you know, to make your own thoughts clearer. Just read work you probably disagree with. It's so helpful. But for me, I'm not saying like that Lacanian, you know, lenses are, you know, wrong in an empirical sense or whatever. But where I see the main difference being, I think that maybe there's two main differences. Where I feel like Lacanian approaches, there's a lot of focus on the unconscious, which means we're automatically sort of talking about things that even the actor we're trying to analyze themselves is potentially not aware of, right? So that creates a whole new layer of, because not only do I need to interpret someone else's actions, I need to interpret someone else's actions who themselves might not understand the motivations for their own actions. So it creates like, which means, I don't know, I often feel like, well, at that point, it becomes too easy to almost like project anything into that. And at that point, I feel like I'm often just not super convinced. That's not necessarily a good argument. That's my personal opinion. But beyond that, I think, for example, there within one aspect of Lacanian thought that's often brought into OSS is obviously the idea of the split self, right? The idea that the self is never whole because there's, you know, this by being in a society, it forces us to sort of like, you know, let go of some parts of our true self, and therefore we're always split, and therefore there's always this sort of underlying anxiety. And, you know, my personal view on that is that might be true, but if I don't consciously experience that anxiety, you know, does it matter whether my self is split or not? Isn't my action often more guided by what I can consciously feel and experience? So that's like an issue I kind of have with that. I think also if you expand it to other kinds of existentialist thought, so existentialism beyond just OSS, obviously. You know, if you read like Sartre, De Bois, other key thinkers of the existentialist canon, you know, there's a huge part of it is moral philosophy. It's like, what is the right thing to do? You know, like in these difficult situations, how am I authentic? Like, what is the right thing to do? And also, it's because you can sort of make choices about what the right thing to do is. Then that's then why you can be held responsible for your actions, right? But then I feel like, and this is maybe going a bit beyond OSS specifically, but if you attribute too much value or too much emphasis to unconscious processes, are people still responsible for their actions? Because, you know, it's maybe just unconscious processes, you know, like how do we hold people responsible? So these are like some of the differences I see between existentialist and Lacanian application. But I'm obviously very biased in one corner. And I am also not a huge expert on Lacan or psychoanalytical approaches in general. So it might also just be that my understanding is not the best. And then obviously people are also very selective in bringing in psychoanalytical insight, right? They're not bringing all of Lacan into OSS, but only certain aspects that they find useful. So maybe there are other aspects of Lacan that I would agree with that just do not happen to show up in anything. So I don't know if that, you know, answered your question, but these are like some of the thoughts I have, I guess, on that distinction.
Thank you so much, Nasu, also for this great question. We have another oral question from Enes, so I'm sending him a request to open the mic.
Okay,
There you go.
thank you. Thank you, Nina, for your presentation, but specifically, I want to thank you for your contribution, critical contributions to the literature, because before the reading your articles, I was thinking the second wave and first wave of the literature, and I was calling the first wave as studying of security of cognitivity. And I was critical about the calling the studying something about mind as ontological. I don't believe that it's not ontological. If we call it as ontological, we need to focus at the same time the body or we need more materialistic approaches. And my question is about implementing the security, ontological security studies. We have a very young researchers group, and we read many articles about the literature, but we couldn't find how can we implement the theory to the practice, and what kind of details we need to focus to find a gap or something to study ontological security. For example, irrationality is a key concept, but should we find only irrational motivations or choices of states or some other parts of state or some other actors' minds or choices, behaviors? I want your advice actually for the youngest ones. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I believe there are probably two questions in there. So first of all, the notion of ontological, I think maybe that's really something that needs to be emphasized more when we write about this, but that the word ontological, the way Lang used it, is not the same as ontological as we know it from philosophy of science, right? So whereas in philosophy of science, ontology is about, what exists, Lang is quite explicit that he just uses it as an adjective for being. So it's just, someone who exists, who experiences the world, which is a slightly different notion or meaning to the word ontological itself, which I think can create some confusion. And I think maybe we, as scholars, as we talk and write about this, maybe we're not often very clear about this. But more practically, like how to find, a gap, or how to apply, the framework empirically. So I'm absolutely the wrong person to ask about empirical applications. I don't know if you could tell, but it's not really my strong suit. But I do think that, the traditional way has been basically to see, where, what cannot be explained very well with like traditional physical security material approaches, and then bring like an ontological security explanation in. And it's not, you can never, like, this isn't like a chemistry lab, like we cannot make conclusive experiments about which theory is better, but we can make arguments about what maybe we find more convincing. And I think, like, oftentimes, it's not that an ontological security lens supersede existing arguments or invalidate them. I think oftentimes what it does is actually just offers a new perspective, or it highlights new aspects that so far were not considered, right? So if we look at the whole, Russia-Ukraine situation, well, ontological security probably has a lot to do with why Russia is doing what it's doing. Is that the only reason? Maybe not. Is it as simple as saying, oh, ontological security is better than all other approaches? Probably not, right? So it's more about, where can an ontological security lens, highlight something new or uncover an aspect that previously was not discussed. And in this context, I think, I think it depends on how you for yourself understand on the term ontological security. But to my mind, the way I understand it is that actually most of us are ontologically secure most of the time, right? And if that is the case, then at least, the things that, in that sense, ontological security is a constant that is at work all the time, everywhere. And so at the very least, I guess, we should be able to identify, those mechanisms or those things that keep us ontological secure most of the time, everywhere, in any situation with every actor. It's just maybe sometimes we're not really attuned to it because we're looking for anxiety rather than ontological security, So that's the best answer I can give. I think in terms of how do you make a contribution to the literature, I think it depends very much on your way of doing. I like to look at concepts, right? So for example, you could question the concept of irrationality or whatever concept, find interesting and think, okay, how do people use it? How do they think about it? What consequences? But then other people, are more empirically minded. They're more intrigued maybe by, real world phenomena. And this is not, and the kind of thinking I'm very attuned to. But I think often what happens, as you talk to other people about your ideas, you will find that other people, even though you both might get ontological security argument, make slightly different assumptions or use it slightly different way. And I think that's, where often the contribution is, those differences, right? Just to, once you notice that someone views something differently or would apply the concept differently to you, to just basically say, hold up a minute, why would we do this differently? And I think so often we're just so focused on overcoming this difference and trying to find, a common way of thinking and talking about it. But it's actually, once we see, okay, hold on a minute, why are we thinking about this differently? Is there something here, that makes us think about things differently? That's maybe, if you can just articulate this, then that's usually already a good start, right? That's the best advice I can give. But
thank you very much to Enes, also Nina, for this great answer. If we can take a couple of more minutes, because we have also 3 written questions, so that maybe we can also take them in. There are 2 questions from Kanchan, if I pronounce their name correctly, so sorry if I mispronounce. Thanks for the lecture, Professor. When we talk about ontological security studies, we regard state as a body and self, in my limited understanding, that has a trauma or insecurity. Why do we need this lens in this first place? Why can't we understand state as an institution that deals with trauma and insecurity? Second, when we look at this way, identifying state, are we endangering the research to historical and cultural relativism? There was another one, but maybe we can go ahead with this one and then return to Kanchan again one more time. Because there was another question posed by them as well.
Give me a second as I'm trying to read through the question again.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding the question.
If Kanchan is here, maybe we can kindly ask them to speak it out loud or give us some details. There is another point by Kanchan, maybe it can also help us understand them better. They say, often in the case of OSS, even with the inclusion of varied perspectives as competing narratives of state's own self, this presupposition of state as a singular being jeopardizes the multitude that the state is, possibly regarding the state and the identity point that you made, probably, as far as I understand the question.
Okay, I think this one I understand more easily, often the case of even with the inclusion of competing concept. I mean, I think obviously, it's totally fair, I think, to critique and to be critical of conceiving of the state as one person, as a singular actor and entity, right? And I think there's a lot of scholarship out there that has critiqued that and that makes very valid points about it. I'm not necessarily in disagreement with that. But I guess for me personally, I think I'm just like, well, but isn't it the case that in our heads, we often think of states as single entities? You know, well, maybe that's wrong that we do that, but isn't that what many of us do? You know, I think most of us maybe have a more nuanced understanding of our own states, but the moment we talk about, you know, states at somewhere far away, isn't it that we think, you know, our state X is doing this, state X is doing that, they should, you know, apologize for X, Y, and Z, they should, you know, isn't that how we, and I mean we as just generally like people living on this planet, how most of us sort of like rightly or wrongly think about state, and isn't that sort of like in a way self-reinforcing, and perhaps also how states then come to view themselves and others, right? So I mean, I don't obviously there is so I think that's the ontological argument, what I think is in the world, and I think, you know, there is this understanding of states as unique single actors in the world that has a real effect. But beyond that, I think there's also there's an analytical argument, as in like, you know, it depends on your research question and what you're interested in, right? And sometimes it might be more useful to think of the state as a single actor, and then sometimes it's way more useful to recognize the multitudes and the differences that make up a state. And that is something that is, I think, more of a methodological issue related to what it is you're interested in. So therefore, personally, I would never say that, you know, I would never categorically say that one way of doing IR or looking at states is wrong or right. I think it's very situational, depending on what it is you're interested in, if that makes sense. But I do think that obviously, you know, and it's important to recognize, obviously, that if, you know, in my research, I do talk about states as single actors, I am also reinforcing that idea that they are, which might be, you know, contributing in some way to the kind of violence that states do, right? So I don't mean to like not acknowledge that. At the same time, I think it's mostly an analytical.
Yeah, thank you so much. There was another question by Minkyun Park. Thank you for the great presentation. They have 3 questions. Maybe we cannot go one by one, or they ask, how do OSS scholars go about distinguishing fear-mongering, anxiety-inducing, rational political strategies, or, for example, politicians from ontological security? The first question, if that makes sense.
So I think, again, you know, this is going to be different from scholar to scholar, and where what assumptions each scholar makes. There is obviously, you know, work in OSS that looks at how some politicians quite, you know, intentionally and explicitly use, you know, fear-mongering rhetoric to then, you know, rally people behind a specific solution that is supposed to provide a sense of ontological security. So I'm not quite sure that the two are necessarily like distinct. I think they, yeah, so I think, but at the same time, you know, if the second part of the question is because, you know, OSS often employs, you know, autobiographical narrative and content analysis of key politicians, that's like, that goes back to like the large variety within the literature that I talked about, where it's like, yes, some scholars will focus very much on the narrative part and narrative coherence, but others will not do that. So I think it's hard to really say like what OSS as a whole does with that, right? So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, perfect. Then we get from Mehmet Ali, then we return to another question by another colleague of ours. So I sent a request to Mehmet Ali, and I invite him over to the stage, to the floor. The floor is yours, Mehmet.
Okay, thank you, Erman. Thank you, Nina. Thank you for your presentation. I have achieved a different perspective about ontological security theory. As we know, we follow the literature, but different perspective that you suggest us. And I have a special question about, post-colonial imaginaries in the context of the, ontological security. How can you analyze the in the context of the self and other? How can we adopt the ontological security theory, non-existent groups, subaltern groups, and homeless refugees, and women in somewhere? This is my question. Thank you for all, and I'm waiting your assessments.
This is a tricky one. I actually think it speaks to a little bit something, a question I sidestepped a little in this presentation. But I mean, I think to my mind, like when I, talk about states as persons, so there is just the question, what even is a person, right? And to just give a very brief answer to that, like a person, I think, is someone who has recognized autonomy, agency, to make, therefore, decisions for themselves, right? To have that autonomy and agency recognized by others, which I think is what we usually, denote with the term dignity, right? So to treat someone with dignity is to treat someone as a person, as opposed to an animal or an object. Like, a person is someone with this recognized capacity for autonomy, agency, making decisions, also being able to be held accountable for them. And in my work, I partially talk about how I think, if you undermine someone's personhood, if you if you no longer recognize their ability to make their own independent decisions or to be like independent agents, if you take that away, that is sort of like a profound ontological security threat, more profound than a threat to like a particularized identity, right? And all of this is to say, I think maybe this is how I would like think about it also in terms of like, marginalized groups, whether that is like post-colonial entity, ethnicities, gender, whatever it might be, where I think oftentimes what we see there is like, where their independent agency is not being recognized, right? Or like they're not treated with the same dignity in a way that maybe would be like necessary for someone to actually feel ontologically secure. Not sure if that leads to a proper application of what I said, but I think there's certainly avenues or like ways within the literature to also, dig more into post-colonial imaginaries, as you call them, like to use these concepts to sort of try to draw out how different groups might feel differently because of these dynamics, because something that is crucial for ourselves maybe is not recognized or is not given. That's about the best answer I can give for now. I'm not personally working on post-colonial stuff myself, but I think, yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. Like, it's like along the notion of personhood. Maybe that's helpful.
Thank you, Mehmet Ali Hocam, and Nina as well. So we return to another written question. That will be the last written, and then I'll return to Batur Ozan Hocam to get his question as well, to his assessment at least also. By Ali Demir, thank you for your presentation about the ontological security theory. Can we explain leaders' diplomacy, such as Xi Jinping rejuvenation of Chinese nation policy, and also Tsai Ing-wen's Taiwanese nationalism, which you also touched upon a bit of Taiwan's policies, nationalism policy with the framework of ontological security theory?
So the superficial answer is yes, you can explain everything in terms of ontological security, at least at the superficial level. I think maybe what's more interesting is because ontological security theory obviously assumes that everyone strives for ontological security, whatever that might mean or however it might be achieved, right? But everyone strives for it. And if that is the case, then we can assume that Xi Jinping and Tsai Ing-wen also do that. And I think, so this question, I think, actually gets more to the relational aspect of how the two probably have a very different idea of what, ontological security looks like for them. And that it's because these ideas are not compatible that we then end up with these kind of like deep going conflicts, right? And I think that's maybe actually the more interesting argument, rather than saying that, like both Xi Jinping and Ing Tsai-wen, they have like their own, obviously, nationalism, but nationalism studies can tell us that, right? So we do not necessarily need OSS for that. But I think what OSS unique contribution maybe is more like, why it's so difficult to compromise on these things, because, why we feel, or why in this case, maybe people in mainland China and Taiwan feel so strongly about it, like, because it really goes to not only how they see themselves, but also how they sort of understand their own place in this world, And I think sort of like drawing out some of those dynamics and sort of like the psychological impact, I think that's more where the unique contribution is, rather than saying, oh, well, every state, needs to have its own nationalism to function in this or that way, like, and then it becomes like, this is not to say that an OSS explanation or lens is always better than a nationalism or another kind of explanation or lens, but an OSS lens can sort of highlight certain aspects that maybe go overlooked in other kinds of things.
Thank you so much. So to not take more of your time, because it's been already 1.5 hours, maybe we can invite one more question, and then later on we can conclude the session. So I'm inviting Batur Ozan Hocam to the virtual stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ayman, and to all the Ontological Security Group, you, Şebnem, Nasu, and Samer, for organizing this. I am very thankful, and thank you, Dr. Krickel-Choi, for your great speech. I have also benefited from your work greatly. I was going to ask about your approach to anxiety in particular. So your work is already familiar with the concept of transcending binaries in terms of how you approach the mind-body or the self-body dualism, how you try to combine the two or see the connections between them. So I was wondering whether a similar approach could be applied to your take on anxiety, how you distinguish between anxiety and existential anxiety. I was going to ask about how you interpret the Heideggerian view on anxiety as this ground mood that makes other emotions or moods possible, that would allow for, I'd say, both of your versions of anxiety, perhaps. Professor Rumeli already uses this approach, or perhaps also with some influence from Paul Tillich's work, by seeing existential anxiety as this ground mood. We also have a room for the existentialist emphasis on agency by seeing these two as two different paths that the individual, or in our case, the state, can take, whether we choose fear and objectify our threat perception and go back to old routines, or whether we embrace anxiety and have room for change, have room to perhaps remake ourselves. So my question is, what would your how would you interpret this understanding of anxiety as this singular, but as a singular mood with multiple options through which the individual or the state can take one's own path, with, of course, external constraints involved?
Thank you. Wow, this is a difficult question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. Partially because I am not too familiar with Heidegger's notion of ground mood. I mean, I'm familiar with the work by Baharu Melili when she uses Heidegger in her work, but I'm not actually too sure about Heidegger's notion itself. So I'm not sure how much I can say about this, but I think, and I think here it depends, I guess, then I would assume that there are just some differences in Heidegger's understanding of anxiety and Lang's understanding of anxiety, right? Due to where they're coming from and what their purpose is in outlining these ideas. And so for Lang, obviously, it's obviously, anxiety is something that is very much, personally felt. And that is sort of like something that, is not necessarily a constant. So if Heidegger, speaks of anxiety as a ground mood, that could just be sort of something that I guess is there, but isn't like, felt in the same way as like personal psychological anxiety. I don't know. If that is different, I guess then there's a room for combining them and sort of like, I guess like merging those insights or using them to do something different. But to be honest, maybe I need to go and read up on Heidegger. That sounds quite interesting. So I'm not sure if I have a good answer for you there, but I think this is a very interesting way also to think about, right? And obviously, my purpose, in making a distinction, for example, between normal anxiety and existential anxiety is not, I mean, it's an analytical distinction, and I think in order for a distinction, to be clear and have value, you need to kind of oppose it to something. But that doesn't necessarily mean, that in an ontological sense, I want to open up a new binary that cannot be overcome or something, right? So that is not the purpose of what I'm trying to do. But it does raise some interesting questions, like at the same time, I remember when I first articulated the idea, Philip Adis asked me, like the difference between normal and existential anxiety, like he asked that question, like, is it different in kind or is it just a different in degree? Is existential anxiety just stronger, right? Because then it would be sort of more of a continuum, I guess. And I ultimately came down on that. I think those are different kinds. But there's certainly room here to sort of think that through again and to see, if it would be more useful or more interesting to then dissolve that binary, right? So I think it's quite interesting to think about, but I don't have a good answer.
Thank you so much both to Ozan Hocam and Nina. So thank you so much, Nina, once again. I think it might be a good time to conclude the session because it's been 1.5 hours and you provided an extensive overview of the current state we are at on ontological security, and you also went beyond as you did with your recent work as well. So I will invite all colleagues with videos to join me. Also, the colleagues we have here in the chat room as well, to thank Nina for being with us and supporting us, because we have been in touch for almost 3 or 4 months just to organize this webinar, because there have been unfortunate events along the way. But finally, I think it was a good time just to come together online and to reflect on the current state of ontological security theory. So thank you, Nina, and all the colleagues for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. Looking forward to see you next month, hopefully at MPSA.
Yes.
And all the best to all the colleagues and everyone. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.